Welcome to our session today, International Student Enrollment in Crisis. I'm Clare Rawlins, Vice President of International Student Recruitment and Marketing at Capital International, and I'll be chairing our session today. We're very fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel of guests who have experience from a range of sectors and regions within higher education. I'd like to welcome Lucy Stonehill, CEO and founder of BridgeU, Patrick Holan, co-CEO and co-founder of Holan IQ, Mary Struzska Tyamayev, Director for the Center of Global Education at Simmons University, Boston, and Ken Hopkins, Vice President for Enrollment at Arizona State University. I think you'll all agree we're in good hands for a lively discussion about the state of international student recruitment in the world at the moment. The title of this session is International Student Enrollment in Crisis, but some people would ask, is it really a crisis? Certain statistics certainly suggest a looming crisis. Universities Australia has warned of 20,000 job losses as $3 to $4 billion is wiped off university income from international student enrollment fees. A survey by the National Association of Colleges in Canada showed that they were expecting a 2/3 drop in international student enrollments this fall. And a number of people predict a 70-year low for international student recruitment in the US this year. Amongst this gloomy or potentially gloomy picture, certain regions and certain types of institutions are more affected. Institutions in the UK, Canada, Australia, and the USA that have invested heavily in international student recruitment are more susceptible to the impact of lower tuition fees from international students. But in some countries and some sectors, we're actually seeing some positive signs. And crisis can also bring innovation and accelerate trends already in existence. We're seeing great investment in the edtech industry, and I think we'll hear more about that later. Much greater take-up of online education than we've ever seen before. And in markets such as India and China, where there was traditionally a slow take-up and some suspicion of that mode of study and increased activity. And we're also seeing some increases in transnational education in the Middle East as the oil crisis heightens focus on expenditure. So I think we'll certainly see there's a range of opinions on this topic. So I'll now pass over to the panel to hear some of their thoughts. And Patrick, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Sure. Thanks, Claire. Wonderful introduction. Yeah, it's such a fascinating title for this session, isn't it? Like international education in crisis. And I think that it's important in a time like now to think more broadly about everything, but international education specifically. I think at last count from memory, according to UNESCO, pre-pandemic, there was something like 4 or 5 million international students around the world. And there was at least double, if not triple, the demand for that. Students all around the world who wanted to travel to study, but who couldn't. And, what seems like such an old-fashioned model now of transnational in this kind of digital world, it's, I think, and you said it, Claire, like crisis and opportunity are kind of the flip side of the same coin. And in many respects, is it really travel that defines an international student, or is it with all of this resurgence of, innovation in higher education? I mean, I hear those statistics around, some of the impacts that are happening directly to institutions, and that's terrible. On the flip side, it's forcing us all to innovate and to serve international students in new ways. I'm definitely concerned about what international students bring to institutions when they're there on campus with their peers, and the diversity that brings students who are studying in their home country but get to study alongside people from all around the world. And as you mentioned as well, Claire, like we've seen some investment activity in EdTech, which would suggest there's a whole bunch of people who think international education will, burst back onto the scene when borders open and it's safer for us all to travel. So I'm an optimist. I don't like to dwell on the crisis. I don't deny that there is some severe and very negative impacts on lots of folks and students as well, who would really have preferred to be studying in those markets. But I also see this as a significant opportunity for us to redefine international education too. So starting off on a little bit of a different flow there, but if I've learned anything through this crisis, is to think differently about things the way I may have in the past.
Thank you, Patrick.
I'm happy to chime in on a few points that Patrick made, and I think probably maybe the theme of this does become what is the flip side of that coin, and how do you sort of reposition an industry that's otherwise recruited in the same way for a very long period of time, and as you say, Patrick, actually prioritize perhaps only one segment of the true demand for higher education more globally. I think there's a couple of things I just wanted to pick up on, one of which is around the importance of diverse student communities. And of course, that's true domestically as well as internationally. And I think, certainly, I think some of the language, a number of governments have been throwing around doesn't necessarily treat the students that I think a lot of us are very close to with I think, the duty of care that they deserve. But one of the things I would say, and I'm certainly seeing this in how we work with universities, is that when you start to engage higher education admissions or recruitment professionals with an opportunity to use innovation or virtual platforms to engage students, they're not having to simply get on a plane and travel to the easiest metropolitan hub in the middle of South Asia. They're actually able to engage students from much further flung areas, whether that's regional communities of students or even students in parts of the world that previously wouldn't have, I think, had the opportunity to gain that type of exposure. So I certainly feel that there's a number of ways that, I guess, forcing, because it does feel like it's forcing at this stage, but forcing recruitment and admissions representatives to use innovation, to use technology-enabled ways of connecting with student and high school communities is actually forcing some really positive engagements with aspects of the wider population of students that previously perhaps weren't so participatory. So I guess that was sort of one of the first points that I wanted to make. But I guess the other thing, again, and I think it's really fascinating, look at what, in particular in the US, a lot of the higher ed universities and a lot of the colleges and universities have been relying on certain ways of engaging with students through pre-existing marketing channels that have never really been challenged. And I'm thinking in this case of the likes of the College Board and the ACT, right? Kids weren't able this year to take standardized tests, which I think a lot of people have long felt have had their challenges and flaws in and of themselves. But what's really interesting now is you're seeing universities say, actually, we were traditionally reliant upon this one channel. What are other ways that we might engage more proactively and allocate budget, albeit I recognize in some cases this year that might be more limited than perhaps it was in other years, but there is an opportunity to take even limited budget, I think, and invested in new channels that have an opportunity to, again, target perhaps a broader population of students, but also teach universities new ways of doing their job, perhaps even better than they were doing them in the first place. So just a couple of comments from me, I guess, and again, similar to Patrick, sort of seeing the positives as part of the silver lining of where we find ourselves.
Lucy, on your point on standardized, especially standardized testing and those, but that's quite interesting because although we're looking at the positive side of this coin, I don't think it should be lost on us that we're not talking only about one crisis. We're not talking about COVID-19. We're talking about at least two crises, right? We're seeing this wave of racial awakening across the US, but also across the world, having conversations we weren't had before. And this work around diversity, equity, and inclusion that's been happening in universities across the world has tended to be very separate from the work of international student recruitment, international student enrollment. And usually when you're in the university, these are going up very different channels. So you have somebody who's in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, somebody who's in charge of international programs or recruitment, and they don't ever meet. And this is a great moment for innovation, collaboration, to really get to the point that these are not necessarily two different things. We're talking about students of varying identities coming to our campuses, wherever it be in the world, and they do need supports, and they should be included in this general piece. And this is when even this conversation about standardized tests, there's been a lot of discussion about it's not equitable, accessible. It is a system that prioritizes those who are able to pay for extra prep classes and basically fund their way to a better score. So I think it all falls into similar bucket. And the other piece of, if we're thinking about international higher education as a whole, a bit broader, there's also a lot of innovation in there. So while we are here talking about international student recruitment, the other side of the international higher ed coin, study abroad, is also currently, well, one is hurting in that it is, you can't take students from one side of the world and put them in a plane in another. So which is again, the flip side of recruiting students or even bring them for short-term programs. There is a lot of innovation around virtual engagement, but there's been also development of partnerships that weren't there before, where you take a campus that with which you partnered for years to bring students from the US or from wherever to that point B. They're now opening up their doors to other students who are outside of the country as a third middle point, to say you can engage with this curriculum, with our curriculum, even if you can't physically get to this country. So there is a lot of innovation there that's happening. And it's wonderful to see, because we in the field of education in the ivory tower sometimes tend to be slow on the change, where the rest of the world has moved on and changed to the big new thing, and we are still 20 years ago trying to catch up with what the terminology is and what is happening. So this is quite inspiring. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
So Patrick, Lucy, and Mary, it's been a pleasure getting to know you. And I feel like we're global citizens, and to be able to dialogue on this topic is a sheer pleasure. And Claire, thank you for our engagement over the past couple of years. Kaplan is such a great partner with Arizona State University. And it's because of the people at Kaplan and how you view student success that makes our students successful. And finally, I'd be remiss, since I'm from ASU, to thank ASU GSV for this opportunity to dialogue on this extremely important topic. As I step back and listen to my colleagues share their thoughts with you, the word crisis is in the presentation topic, but I think what you just heard is crisis makes you think and act differently, or you become immobile in it. You have choices. And the crisis in international enrollment, at least from the States, didn't occur during the pandemic. It didn't occur in January of 2017. It's been in a bit of flux really since 2015. And some of the comments that you heard earlier, so our partners in the Middle East stepped back and looked at their investment in their citizens in 2015 and really stepped away from an investment in intensive English programs and thought about ways to invest in their citizens differently. So in Saudi Arabia, there's a country investment in teacher educators. That's thinking differently about how a country looks at their future and how they invest in education. I'm going to stay with that same tie with the Middle East. I was very concerned during this pandemic. I was joking with my colleagues that on March 16th, it was the Monday right after spring semester, we went on a 2-week, we're going to teach remotely and we're going to see where this takes us. We lasted a day, and we decided that the rest of the spring semester, we would teach remotely. Well, I was very concerned about our students from the Middle East, because there is a bit of this perception that online education, even though we don't view Zoom learning or remote learning as online, but how would our colleagues, how would our cultural attaches, how would the ministries of higher education look at how they're investing in their degree-seeking students and go, this isn't going to work? It did. And actually, I was so thrilled to share our spring degree achievement rates of students from every country. We held meetings with the cultural attaches, the LA Kuwait Cultural Office, the Saudi Cultural Mission, the UAE, and we were so pleased that our students persevered and they actually performed better in the spring of 2020 than the students who were with us in the spring of 2019. Our students changed. We had to change. Countries had to change. And then I'll just make one last point about change and crises, and it's India. And so this fall, we welcomed 160 first-year students from India who are remote learners. Last year, we had 91 students, first-year students from India join us here in the Valley. Those students persevered. They could have stopped, they could have looked at other options, but they stayed as remote learners. Now, on the opposite side is many of our Indian nationals who were really trying to seek a US experience that is coupled with an optional practical training experience. You get the degree and then you go out and work, and that changes your life. That changes your family's life. We saw a huge pause of our master's students. A number of students have deferred to the spring semester. Well, guess what? The embassy opened on August 17th. Our classes started on the 20th. There were actually some Indian nationals who were interested in getting here for the fall semester. And we're actually welcoming some students now where they started as remote learners and now they're joining us as campus-based learners. So yeah, sure, we're in a crisis, we're in a pandemic. We've had to isolate. You have to keep yourself healthy and safe. We've got to do that for our students, but we have to help them imagine the possibilities. And so, as we dialogue with you today and you listen to our panel discussion, I hope you don't think we're all on helium or something like that. We are probably all eternal optimists because we believe in global education. We believe that education is transformative, and we've got to figure out ways of how to make that work.
Well, and the underlying tenet of global education, right, is flexibility, is being comfortable in ambiguity. That is literally the whole point of going and experiencing another culture in depth, is having that creativity. I think there's quite a bit of research that demonstrates that people who spend a long time in a different culture become more creative and more flexible. So as people who are, what is the English expression? There's a Russian language expression that says talks about a bootmaker with no boots, right? Somebody who does it for everybody else, but doesn't have it for himself. We can't do that. So we have to have that optimism, and not only empty optimism, but an in-depth understanding of the innovation can come. What innovation can come? Speaking to Ken's point of changes in how other nations interact with education, even thinking back to what maybe 10 years ago, for example, when for example, Kazakhstan was investing so much money in bringing Kazakh students into the US while they were sort of thinking about restructuring their educational system from the Soviet era system into a different system. Now we're not seeing that anymore. They have their system that they've built. Doesn't necessarily mean that the interaction between students and people from Kazakhstan has stopped. It has changed how it looks. It has took on a different topic and how the engagement happens. So the result of this will be that all nations really invest in their own internal education system, so they wouldn't be coming to the UK or the US or Australia for the same, we are just looking for this brand of education. They'll be coming for something else, and we will figure out what something else is, and go with that. So it is just the next step in our development of this field.
All right, let's go.
There you go.
I was just reflecting on why we have taken this frame of reference. Like, and I kind of, at least my own take is, like, everyone on this, all my colleagues here are kind of super experienced kind of international education folks, and you know, the whole crisis positioning, you know, is in some respects a call to action to lament what's happened. And you know, I think you're just hearing kind of people who are not in denial and are reflexing into what am I going to do about this? Like, you know, one way you're seeing folks around the world respond is kind of cross their fingers and like don't worry, it'll all be back, and you know, COVID shall pass and they'll all be back on planes, and the focus is on, you know, competing for the flow. But I see there's so many more mindsets, which is wonderful, which is, you know, what if it doesn't? And what if this is an inflection point? And, you know, we should think really differently about this. And I love how Mary consciously or unconsciously kind of even framed it as global education. You know, international education is a loaded term. It's like, it's agents, it's fairs, it's like, it's old school international education. And, you know, this has, in a tragic way, in some respects, forced us to, and is forcing us to reinvent. And I think, hopefully, and we have to be mindful, it needs to be better for our institutions, it needs to be better for our domestic students, it needs to be better for students from wherever they are around the world. And the other reflection, just quickly, which Ken touched on, is this is affecting nations. You know, there are students for sure everywhere who wish they could be studying right now in their kind of destination of choice. But you know, for all of us around the world, every country is trying to work how to emerge from this stronger, and key to that is talent. And that's why governments are sitting around like, what are we going to do? Like, we're not sending thousands of our best and brightest to study around the world and to bring that knowledge back. What is our alternative? It's in many respects sometimes framed as a B2C, dare I kind of use a model term, but this is so much as much about governments and employers as it is about students too.
I think that's such a good point, Pat, and just sort of picking up a little bit on, I guess, the two comments that Mary was making that you made. I think, you know, what's certainly quite fascinating from our perspective is when I started Bridge 6-7 years ago, and we now work with international and global secondary schools in about 120 countries. So we represent a very sizable proportion of students from a really diverse range of regions and markets and micro markets. And back then, 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was this very, very dominant trend of there was a very clear and single pattern of mobility. It was from certain countries into predominantly, you know, the countries that we started off this conversation with, the English-speaking, largely Western destinations. And I think what you made a point of saying this, Kent, that actually that's been now changing for 5, 6, 7 years. It's now come under the spotlight in a really meaningful way because of how, you know, devastated so many institutions are, particularly in the US and UK, by what's happened and students not being able to kind of show up on campus in the same way. But, you know, in the background, one of the things that we've been tracking with every graduating cohort is how more and more students are choosing, and I say this because some of them are making the choice between the US and Singapore, just to give you an example, or the Netherlands. They are making the choice to see some of the higher ed institutions closer to home as actually genuinely a viable alternative. And I liked your point, you know, Mary, about raising this, that, you know, in the background, I think, you know, higher ed is, as you know, it's been largely a US, UK, Canada, and Australia game for a really long time now, and that has led to, one might argue, not as much change and innovation, and needing to fight for students and needing to evolve and think about diversifying pathways and routes into the institutions, and perhaps even needing to define programs for the benefit or the success of students. And so I think this other dynamic here, which is certainly very prevalent in the data that we capture, is this kind of global rise kind of the local competition. And, you know, so many governments, to your point, Patrick, are, you know, whether it's, you know, China, you know, Korea, you name it, have very aggressive targets for attracting some of the best talent to their countries, to be part of creating that kind of student community and recognizing the value of doing so. But then also, I think the point about talent, graduating some of the best talent into the Chinese workforce. And so I think it's a couple of interesting sort of general observations based on what you were all saying. And in a way, I think this is all kind of coming under the spotlight based on the last 6 months and the fact that we're sort of living in a, you know, in a kind of unprecedented time from the perspective of the global pandemic. However, a lot of these trends have been on the rise for some time now. And I think, you know, I think there's an opportunity for the universities who are in those sort of traditionally popular host destinations like the US and the UK to come out really strong, but to recognize that they need to change, and they are fundamentally, whether or not it's something they talk about every day, operating in a much more globally competitive environment.
And I mean, in those 5 years, there were so many kind of 5-6 years, there have been all these sort of murmurs. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversify where you're from. Diversify what you're doing. And some of us listened, some of us didn't. Nobody could predict that, you know, not putting all your eggs in one basket in the sense of diversifying location wouldn't still help in this situation. But I think it now, all those sort of doomsday predictions have been fast forwarded. And I think that even people who weren't thinking about international education or global education or international students are now thinking about it. I live and work in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, a city that is full of universities. You students are a lifeblood of the city in many ways. And a significant piece of that student population is international. We have restaurants closing, entire neighborhoods being silent, and this is a metropolitan area. I think about, you know, my alma mater in the Midwest, some of these smaller university towns that like live for that student population. Without them being there, it's becoming very visible that not only do we need these students for our industry, to bring innovation, to graduate the best and brightest into the US industry, but also even from day to day as consumers. So I think that will also change how we relate to international students and to that need. I'm curious to see where it's going to bring us in the next, 10 years or so.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone. Some fascinating points there. I wanted to just follow up on a couple of areas that were raised. Clearly, the online space in terms of online learning, online teaching is in booming, but also quite controversial. Ken, can you maybe talk to us a little bit about the difference? You mentioned that your students are not studying online as such. How has ASU managed their student population in this hybrid or new learning world?
Sure. So again, I'll go back to spring semester because we were just coming off spring break. So many of our international students chose to travel, and in some cases were in their home countries. And so they hit pause and they decided to stay. Some of our countries, the UAE in particular, actually came in and brought their students from the Valley back to the UAE. And then the students had to self-quarantine, I should say self-isolate, for 14 days. They're still studying. So they were traveling at the middle of March. They had 7 more weeks to go in the semester, and they were on the move. And so what we did is we had to create a simple report that we sent out to our colleges. How many of our currently enrolled students, our international students, are here and they're still with us? How many have actually submitted documents where they actually want to leave? Because we needed to know that as well. And then how many had departed? It was so important for our colleges and schools to stay on point with that. And like I said earlier, Claire, we got on the phone with our educational partners at our consulates to help them understand that students were still engaged in their course room instruction. it was just being delivered to them differently. They weren't in the classroom, they were in Zoom rooms, and they were continuing on. We got a little bit of pushback from all of our students when we opted not to go to pass-fail and stay on a graded system, because our provost felt that it was really important to learn from this experience, that you're continuing on in your classroom instruction during a very significant moment in this world. Carry on, keep learning. If you want to get a B or you want to get an A, you know what the elements are to get that B or an A in your classroom. Then we had many international students stay with us for our summer sessions. And although we were not able to welcome as many of our degree-seeking students back to the United States, the comfort level of the spring combined with taking classes in the summer. And we did make adaptations, Claire, to our fall semester class schedule so that we had courses that at least our first year students could take in what we call time zone comfortable environments. Now, what we learned is some of our Chinese students didn't want to do that. They wanted to study with people who looked different than they were, because that's why they had chosen a US university. In a couple of weeks, it was kind of hard to get up at Tuesday morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, right, Patrick, to be in a class. But we're allowing our students to be participants in these decisions rather than informing our students that you have to do it a particular way. And so that's a little bit about what ASU has done over these last 3 terms for our international students.
Thank you, Ken. And Patrick, I just wanted to sort of jump in on something you mentioned earlier. Obviously, most of the things we're hearing at the moment are about financial doom and gloom, but we're also hearing of some great investment in EdTech. Are there any specific trends or areas where you're seeing that specifically, or you're forecasting the greatest growth?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit perverse in an environment where we're all challenged economically, but believe it or not, there's an enormous amount of money that's looking to invest in innovation right now, just enormous. And what's happened through the pandemic is it's made education, and specifically higher education, much more conscious in so many people's minds. And so investors as well are kind of looking, and just as we've all discussed, they're saying, wow, this higher education thing hasn't changed in a really long time. And wow, it is really impacted by this trend. And the role of technology would seem to be really helpful to, bridging some of these gaps. And so, investors and many of these entrepreneurs who, for the most part are actually educators who see this as an opportunity, they are, they're on the offense. They're like, right, that, and institutions and students, they're looking for help through this time as well, whether that's, tutoring and test prep help, getting through because they don't have the connectivity that they might have if they're on campus, whether that's their pathway into education. The whole value chain of international education could reconfigure through this period. If there was ever a moment that we would all contemplate doing things differently, it's now. And so there are in the order of probably close to $10 billion of venture capital that will be invested this year, backing new ideas essentially. Some not so new, because those that are attracting that investment have been at it for a while and have a little bit of momentum, and the pandemic and this situation has essentially, really driven a big tailwind for those who kind of got started, which is, it's kind of a little bit scary for some, because it would represent some very significant change if we headed down that path significantly. I think others are excited to see new players, new ideas, new models, and the like. And for the most part, I think it's important to underscore that, nearly every founder that I meet is thinking of students first. Yes, it's all about for many of them, the return on investment for their investors and the like. But I think so many people would be surprised how heartfelt many of these entrepreneurs are at supporting students, and they don't get enough of that credit, when perhaps sometimes they're framed as more typical startups.
Thanks, Patrick. I think certainly, having worked in international sort of student recruitment, global recruitment for a long time, it's surprising how little innovation there has actually been over the years in that field. I think, Lucy, you were right when you touched on a lot of people just panicked when they couldn't get on a plane with an exhibition banner and a box of brochures, the same as they've been doing for the last 20 years. Kind of, what are they going to do? How have you seen people react to that, to that change in their activity plan?
Yeah, it's actually just how you described, Claire. I mean, I think one of the comments that Patrick made, I think is a great one, is that for those of us who've been running education technology businesses or startups or now scale-ups for the best part of 7 years, it is 7 years of knocking on doors and saying, I promise a change is going to come, I promise a change is going to come, and we're going to help you make that change. And then, there's a small percentage of the market that says, all right, we'll innovate with you. And that totally changed March of this year. Partially I don't have to travel, for hours or days to get to a university to have a meeting to say, hey, how are you focusing on this problem, and maybe we can help. So people are actually open to doing meetings. So we can do many back to back, which is highly efficient if you're me. But the other part of it, I think, is exactly as you say, Claire. It's suddenly a very large portion of the market saying, all right, we've been hearing that we need to change for a while, but we've really had this forcing function. And a lot of them are then kind of opening the doors and saying, you know what, we knew this was going to happen. We knew we'd have to change. I think a lot of people, we're all humans. We tend to not change until we have to. So I think, and especially if what you've been doing has been working, it's amazing to me learning as much as I now know about sort of the traditional global recruitment space, how many universities, frankly, have been funding teams of 10, 20, 30 people to just get on a plane and say, see you in 3 months. Like, to me, I was like, I would never send my sales team off without, goals, KPIs, reporting back, and a very clear trajectory for how their efforts were directly attributed to the outputs of those. So I think it is that thing of, there's not now just a minority of innovators saying, okay, let's lean in. There's actually a much wider audience of participants, and I think those universities are really genuine about wanting to lean in. And then I think there's also the release of that sort of not needing to change, this forcing function of suddenly this thing that they all felt was coming on some level is now here. And I think that the institutions that'll be the ones that really come out of this strong and perhaps above or beyond the pack are the ones that as Kent was saying, choose to innovate with their students, with their faculty members, and also with the ed tech or innovation partners that they're working with.
Thank you, Lucy.
And Claire, I would also say, we're in a pandemic. And so what's constant is education and learning. So here's all this other noise. And it's a slight increase for us. We have now 1,200 international learners who are earning their degrees exclusively in an online degree completion program because it's easier. Because I can stay in my home country and I have access to the entire degree, and I don't have to travel, and I don't have to get on a plane, and I don't have to do all these things. And then that online learner and they're mainly graduate learners. They're in graduate programs. So they're making an investment in themselves, or possibly their company is doing it for them. And then, Patrick, it's like the what if. What is going to happen as the borders open, as we have vaccines and capable contact tracing and all those things, that now I've made an investment in myself, or my company has, and then what happens after that? Travel and opportunities. if you're a multinational company, to go from the Shanghai office to the Melbourne office. In essence, you're rearranging the furniture a little bit. So I appreciate, the knocks on hiring and being slow to innovate, but it's also the student who's making decisions about his or her education and going, oh, online learning, I think I'll do this.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ken. No, we've certainly seen at Kaplan that actually our students have been the quickest to embrace change. It's really been all the stakeholders around them who've been a little bit more reticent. We're actually coming up to time now, so I wanted to say a massive thank you to ASU GSV and to all the panel, but also just maybe to close us off, no session on education should really not finish with a comment on students. So Mary, could you maybe any advice, any tidbit just to close us down for any international students who may have joined us?
Definitely. My favorite topic, and you gave me like 30 seconds to talk about it. Woo.
5 seconds, I'm afraid.
5 seconds. Think through, if you're an international student, think through about what's best for you, what makes sense for you today, and what will make sense for you down the road. And you don't have to make those decisions yourself. Reach out to the institutions you're working with. We're here because we love working with you, and we want to talk to you, want to hear how you're doing and help you plan out. So don't struggle with that on your own.
Thank you, Mary. And thanks, Patrick, Ken, Lucy as well. Thanks, everybody.